Greetings and welcome. I'm Dan Little, and I'm just so pleased to be beginning this seminar with you for this semester. The topic is a hugely important one, and one which I've been thinking about very seriously for the last several years. I'm really happy to get a chance to talk through some of these ideas with you over the coming couple of months. I also think it's a topic which is very relevant to the honors program and to the readings you've done in the other courses in this program, including materials which you read in the Four Trials course a couple of years ago. So this course is about something which is enormously important. It's about primarily the 20th century, and it's about the fact that the 20th century was a horrendously horrifying period of time in which 100 million individuals were killed by states, by peoples, by ethnic conflict, by genocide, by starvation. The 20th century could be described as a century of great evil. And so the question which I'm wanting to address and to think about hard and to think about in some new ways, how can we as human beings come to grips with the facts of gross evil which were committed by individuals and states over the past 100 years or so? And I'll just remind you, first, maybe most memorable, genocide and the Holocaust, the Nazi attempt to kill all Jews of Europe and really all Jews on the planet, and the fact that they were successful in killing some 6 million Jews through a determined and organized and almost industrial process of gathering and exterminating 6 million Jews. It was a period of state violence and a period of murder by states against its own people. And here I'm thinking of what is referred to as the Holodomor, the period of time in the 1930s when Joseph Stalin was striving to exert complete and total power, totalitarian power in the Soviet Union, and was enraged at the resistance of rural people, farm people from regions, especially including the Ukraine, and his deliberate plan to extract all the grain from those regions, leading to the death by starvation over a period of 6 months to a year of 3 to 4 million people. This is another horrifying example of evil in the 20th century. But there are other examples: the instigation of mass killings in Bosnia and Rwanda, the ethnic violence and the state-sanctioned and state-organized violence in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. In other parts of the globe, the massive cruelty, violence, rape, and murder against innocent civilians which occurred. And here I'm thinking of the rape of Nanking by the Japanese army in its effort to defeat and dominate China before the United States came into World War II. And the question in front of us is the question, how should we as human beings confront these acts of complete and horrifying evil? And what I would like to kind of underline to you is that there are not clear, definite answers to this question. How should we confront these moments of evil? The problem of evil is actually not exactly the problem I'm interested in having us address. That goes back 300 or 400 years in religious studies and in philosophy. But the problem I'm wanting for us to confront is, it's a harder problem, but a more ordinary problem. It is the fact that human beings and regimes and armies and organizations deliberately, purposefully murdered, starved, tortured, and attempted to exterminate vast numbers of ordinary human beings. And how are we to make peace with those facts about our history? How are we to make sense of those facts? And how are we to move on in a way in which we can pledge to ourselves that things will be better in the future. In particular, the question which I'm interested in pursuing is how historians, professional historians, should address these episodes. And I'd like to ask the question, I'd like for you to ask the question, whether historians have special responsibilities for addressing atrocity, genocide, and the gross violations of human rights, which I've just been describing to you. I'd like to ask all of us, why is telling the truth such an important value for historians? Why isn't it enough to tell a pretty story about our past as opposed to an ugly and truthful story? And why is it that history is so often distorted, occluded, or hidden and misrepresented when it comes to difficult and evil actions in the past? Flipping the point over, what is the long-term value of truthful historical investigation of evil? Is it simply for the sake of being truthful, or can we hope that humanity will somehow, by its bootstraps, make itself better by having had the strength and the courage to honestly confront the evil of its own history? One important part of understanding the evil of the past is the importance of understanding suffering. What do I mean by that? We can think of suffering in a kind of an objective way. It is common to say the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed, and many hundreds of thousands of other people, homosexuals, gypsies, communists. We can give the statistics of the Holocaust. But what I'd like to put in front of you is that it's really important to come to a compassionate understanding, an experiential understanding of what that means, what it means that 6 million Jews were killed, and to try to understand that history, not as an aggregate, but as a kind of an understanding that this is an experience which involved countless human beings, just like you and me, who suffered pain, deprivation, indignity, and death, and that these individuals experienced these things in just the way that you and I would have. Can we put ourselves in the place of Jews being hunted in the Warsaw Ghetto? And can we understand the trauma of being sent to Auschwitz or sent to a shooting pit outside one's village? And the only hope that we have is that our bodies will be recovered by our loved ones. These are life experiences which almost go beyond human understanding, and yet we need to understand them. And this underlines within historical research the value of testimony, the idea of first-person testimony, of memoir, of a recounting of the experiences that individuals had. And the reader is then brought to think about evil actions from an experiential point of view, not merely a descriptive point of view. When we think about the evils of the 20th century, sometimes we make it a little too easy for ourselves. Sometimes we want to understand evil by attributing it to a few evil, perhaps psychotic leaders, Hitler, Stalin, Beria, Goebbels, and dozens of other leaders in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Serbia, the Japanese army, and so forth. And we sometimes maybe think to ourselves, if Hitler had not become Führer, Germany would not have set out on a plan to kill all the Jews. So it was Hitler's fault. If Stalin had lost power in the 1930s, the campaign of starvation which he undertook would not have occurred. So the Holodomor is Stalin's fault. But I would put in front of you that that is too superficial a view of the evil of these events of the 20th century. There's a fact about ordinary followers, ordinary Germans, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of ordinary citizens, men and women, Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and other Central European men and women who willingly participated in the very routine plans and activities of gathering and murdering their neighbors. ordinary people, not Stalin, not Hitler, but just ordinary Poles, ordinary Germans, ordinary Ukrainians who participated willingly, not at the point of a gun, but simply because they were asked to. And these were not psychopaths or sociopaths. They were more or less ordinary citizens who were willing to participate in murder and other horrific crimes against defenseless human beings. We will read some excerpts from just a devastatingly tough book by Jan Gross, a Polish historian, called Neighbors. And it's the account of one Polish village in which was mixed, roughly 3,000 Christians, 3,000 Jews. And on one day, the Christians rose up against the Jews, hunted them down, confined many of them to a church, and killed them all. How can we explain these ordinary perpetrators of evil? Many of you have read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. I believe that you read it in the Four Trials course. And you have read about Eichmann's work as a bureaucrat and as a high-level executive within the Nazi state, working to implement the final solution. And I'm sure you will remember Hannah Arendt's observation about Eichmann. She found him to be quite ordinary, and she describes his actions and his life as representing the banality of evil. This became very controversial in Arendt's corpus, her life work, her work as a political philosopher and observer. But what does it mean, really, to talk about the banality of evil? It suggests the idea that individuals at all levels can incorporate their extraordinary tasks, gathering and killing Jews or Roma or homosexual people, into their career goals, their ordinary career goals. I'd like to be a director, but I'm only a sub-director now, and maybe if I do a really good job in my task of gathering the Jews of Gdansk, then I will be promoted. Their mundane thoughts and aspirations about their own lives intersecting with the evil tasks and coordinating activities which they've undertaken. By the way, Arendt's views are controversial for another reason as well, and that is that Eichmann gave interviews in Argentina, which were published and written about after the trials in Jerusalem, and it became clear he was not just a blind, stupid follower, but rather he was a committed Nazi. He shared deep Nazi convictions. So what is the historian's duty? And in a nutshell, I'd like to put it that it is to face the truth about atrocity, to face the truth about evil actions by a people, by one's own people, by an extended period of time, face the truth about evil and atrocity. And yet there are very powerful forces, political forces, national pressures against telling the truth. There is a desire to silence, a desire to pass over in silence about these terrible truths. Even now in Poland, there's legislation to make it libelous to assert, for historians of the Holocaust, to assert that Poles were willing participants in the Holocaust against Polish Jews. And of course, that is astounding for a state to prohibit historians from directly and honestly asking the question and following historical evidence to the conclusion that they reach. First-person narratives are, in my opinion, very important in understanding evil. Statistics are important. We need to have the descriptive facts about the system of extermination that was underway in Nazi Germany. And it is very interesting to know that there were major historical research problems right after World War II that made it very difficult to maybe impossible to understand the full horror of the system of genocide which the Nazis had created. Impossible because some of the worst locations had been taken by the Soviet Army, the Red Army, and they did not release evidence, photographic evidence, kind of forensic evidence from camps and other locations until well after the end of World War II. So even the descriptive facts were difficult to determine. But I propose to you how important it is for your understanding, for my understanding, and for the understanding of later generations, that we should collect, read, experience, and study the firsthand experiences of survivors, victims, resistors, and possibly perpetrators to understand the circumstances of their lives and the tragic ends of their lives. It is very interesting to me and rewarding, and it's a source of pride to me, that the Holocaust Archive project at UM Dearborn is itself a valuable resource for this precise reason. So we've talked about individuals at every level of the Nazi regime or the Soviet regime or the Serbian government. The evils of the Nazi regime were mediated by individuals, that's certainly true, but corporations and organizations played a crucial role. It is not possible to conduct modern warfare, let alone a modern system of oppression and genocide against a whole people, without large business organizations which are manufacturing things, conducting logistics, running railroads, and supporting the efforts of the state. So corporations had an important role, a morally significant role in the conduct of evil during the Soviet Union time and during the Nazi period. National and multinational corporations provided the war materials for both the Soviet regime and the Nazi regime. And closer to home, the German affiliates of General Motors, Opel, and Ford Motor Company, Ford Werke Cologne, these German companies, which were affiliates of the multinational General Motors and Ford Motor Company, these were the primary manufacturers of trucks, tanks, airplane engines, and the mechanized heart of the German military. These companies made use of forced labor and slave labor, and these facts only became widely known in the very late 1990s. And we now do have a lot of information about the use of forced labor and slave labor, and we'll be talking about some of that, that evidence later in the course. But how today are we to understand corporate behavior with the hindsight of history? What are we to think of corporations which do evil and, in some sense, knowingly do evil? We should also understand that though we're focusing on Holocaust and Holodomor, the atrocities, the genocide, the enslavement, which occurred in Eastern Europe, in the Bloodlands, as Tim Snyder describes the historical context. But we need to recall that evil existed before the 20th century in the colonial world, in the European conquest of African countries, Latin American countries, South American countries, in massacres which occurred in various colonized countries as repressive measures to preserve power. So the deliberate, intentional murder of large numbers of innocent people occurred in the Holocaust, but it also occurred in the administration of colonial regimes in Africa and South America. But closer to home, in the United States, evil existed in the United States in the form of slavery, debt bondage, and the Jim Crow system of racial oppression that emerged post-Reconstruction in the US South. In particular, lynching, the horrific crime against individuals, the crime of lynching was endemic in the American South. In a summary report provided by the NAACP, from 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States, and the report indicates this is almost certainly an undercount. It's not 6 million, but it is a massive use of incomprehensible and horrific violence against defenseless individuals. In other times and places, we can think of the rape of Nanking, which was the activity, the deliberate, cruel activity of the Japanese army in its conquest, first of Shanghai and then especially of Nanking, about 100 miles north of Shanghai, and the horrific use of sexual violence, murder, torture, vivisection, the just horrendous crimes which are committed against the innocent civilian Chinese people of Nanking. It's referred to as the rape of Nanking. But also in the 1990s, within the memory of, not of you probably, but in the memory of your parents for sure, the massacres of Muslims in Bosnia, which occurred following the ethnic mobilization of Serbs following the breakup of Yugoslavia. These incidents, though not numerous in the way that the Holocaust and the Holodomor were, they're evil in the same way. They are crimes against defenseless humanity and crimes which the rest of the world did not do very much to prevent. So the big questions that these topics raise for us in this course, and I just think that we will have such an interesting and challenging set of conversations over the next 12 weeks. First, we can ask a question about human nature. Are human beings intrinsically capable of evil? Is everyone capable of evil? Are we, or are our brothers and sisters, ready to perform atrocities and cruelty in the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances? We can ask also whether ethical ideas evolve as a result of studying the hard periods of history. Can we learn something from the mass murders in Bosnia, which occurred, which might lead us to behave differently politically and socially in such a way that that situation of massacre should never arise again? We can also ask the question, what role do public memory and memorials and commemoration play in changing humanity? And this is a double-edged sword because much memorializing of the past serves an ulterior motive as we think about the struggles over statues of Civil War generals, for example. It's very clear that the struggle is as much over racial issues and white supremacy as it is about what actually happened during the Civil War. We can also ask, what does it mean when, in talking about the Holocaust, we say, never forget? Well, of course, we should never forget the Holocaust, but what does it really mean to not forget? And what I would like to propose to you is it means to incorporate some of the insights we can get from studying the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the massacre of Muslims in Bosnia, incorporate that into our moral culture for tomorrow. And then finally, we can ask the question, is there a deep connection between totalitarianism and mass murder and crimes against humanity? Not all of the crimes that I've mentioned were committed by totalitarian states, but many of them were. And so maybe there's a clue there that the Nazi state, the Stalinist state, these were states which aimed to dominate every aspect of social, political, and individual life. And is there a connection between totalitarianism, which Hannah Arendt, in her book about totalitarianism, she actually believes that this is true. But we can ask ourselves the question, is totalitarianism one of the sources of evil in the 20th century? Oh, one final thought that we should bear in mind, it is the cost of lies and myths in history. If we do not honestly confront the realities of these evil events, I believe we will never move beyond them. We will never correct the social and political dynamics that led to mass murder, lynchings, apartheid, enslavement, and the massive mistreatment of civilians. And this is sort of what underlies one of the great moral ideas which came out of the anti-apartheid movement, the idea of truth and reconciliation, the idea of telling the truth about some of the horrible things which were committed, but then doing the best job we can to continue to move forward and live as a community. So I look forward to a conversation with you over the next 12, 13 weeks, and I think we'll all be able to learn together.